Hello everyone, welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most fantastic podcast in the world. We're your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome to a brand new edition of the TAPED podcast, but we've decided to do something a little different from the usual worst, bests and recaps that we do. Today we're going to be, talking about more music, but we've decided to start a new series, and today we're going to be doing what we're dubbing the genre essentials. And I'm very excited for this. Essentially, how this works is me and Nostalgia have basically taken to a certain genre of music, and we've decided to pick 12 essential albums from those genres. Well, albums that we feel like are essential to the overall sound and genre, and basically just explain why we think they're essential and how we feel about the albums ourselves. And the first installment of this series is going to be on experimental hip-hop. So, yeah, this is going to be a genre that I suppose I'm very well informed in. I love me some experimental hip-hop. Some of my favourite albums of all time are experimental hip-hop releases. And, yeah, I'm excited as hell about this. How about you, Nostalgia?
Fuck yeah, man. This series is hype.
It's
been a long time in the works.
It has, and we can't wait to see the response to this. So, before we get into the actual albums that we picked, we have a few honourable mentions here. Just a couple of albums that we considered putting on the list, but didn't actually make the cut. So we'd like to mention Cloud Dead's Self-Titled, Uneven Compromise and Mr. Thug Isolation by Lil Ugly Mane, and Big Fish Theory by Vince Staples. And yeah, I suppose from there we'll just get started, talk about what we have picked. We have 12 albums here, and we're going to start in chronological order. We are going to start at the year 2000 with the album Deltron 3030 by Deltron 3030. This is one of two albums that was released under the Deltron 3030 name, and this is the moniker of the hip-hop supergroup that consisted of DJ Kid Koala, producer Dan the Automator, and rapper Del the Funky Homo Sapien, who you should know was featured on some pretty important tracks for Gorillaz, most notably the track Clint Eastwood. Hell, even Damon Albarn himself is on the album's opening and closing skits for this record too, so I suppose the favour was repaid there.
Yeah.
And to me, Deltron 3030 is an important and essential album in experimental hip-hop because at the time, this was pushing the boundaries for what hip-hop albums could do in terms of conceptual writing and experimental production. As Deltron 3030 is a moment where two mediums that you wouldn't really expect to cross over eventually did, those being hip-hop and science fiction. I suppose acts in the past have flirted with this, like Outkast, for example, on ATLiens, but not to the extent that it was on Deltron 3030. I say that because hip-hop was an art form that was born out of the realness of black culture and mainly touched upon very real and serious topics on a conceptual basis, and the production mainly featured sounds and samples of specific styles like funk, soul, and R&B. With the question of science fiction, you would really associate it with fantasy-driven narratives based off of technology, the future, aliens, so on and so forth. Well, Deltron 3030 simply is breaking down the fundamentals of hip-hop and making something that's simply just original, conceptual, futuristic, and pretty alternative. Del is lyrically focused on writing a lot of a concept record, based on sci-fi themes of a dystopian future in the 31st century, while also bringing some very real things like corporations, the government, individualism, black culture, and so on. All in a concept album setting, as there's one big narrative going on. Dan the Automator and Kid Koala end up providing a very futuristic, intricate, and kind of abstract and cinematic tone to the album, with beats that sure as hell still sound futuristic to this day, and they sure as hell match what Del is doing fantastically. Well, does all this make this a great album? And do I think it's great? Yes and yes. Deltron 3030 is fantastic. It for sure pushes the boundaries, but it also is such a killer album for its time. It's the first hip-hop... Is it the first conceptual hip-hop album ever made? No, that would go to Kool Keith's alter ego, Dr. Octagon. But is it done well? I'd say it is. It's done pretty damn well, in my opinion. Production is fantastic. There's so many cinematic, dense, and playful beats on this thing that utilize some fantastic samples and sounds, and they really sell the concept of the album. Honestly, it's like a film soundtrack almost, and it's even more like a film when we take into account Del the Funky Homo Sapiens lyricism. The narrative is routed in a lot of science fiction themes and is essentially about Deltron Zero, a robot who rebels against a dictatorship-like oligarchy, and basically they control every aspect of human rights and pretty much outlaws hip-hop. Sure, it's a little corny, but who the fuck cares when it's done incredibly well, which, it's done on here. Del is an absolutely insane MC. I think he's so fucking underrated. His flows are just so good. They're so smooth. He's just insane throughout Deltron 3030. His confident delivery is great, and I love his pen game. It's just so good. There's so many fantastic flows and one-liners that are just too good to ignore. His descriptive imagery is incredible, and he really sells and paints the scene of this dystopian future incredibly well. If there's anything to complain about when it comes to Deltron 3030, then I suppose it would have to be with some of the skits. Some may add to the narrative, but overall there's some pretty pointless one that sort of ruins the flow of the album, and there's way too many of them if I'm being honest. But hey, there's 12 tracks of fantastic hip-hop that pushes the boundaries of what hip-hop can do narratively and production-wise. It's got some killer moments on it, and I definitely recommend it as an essential.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've been wanting to check out this album for months. I'd say even more than months. But I just never got around to it, and finally in preparation for this video I got around to listen to this project. And it immediately left such an impression on me that I already consider it one of the greatest hip-hop albums of all time, just 2 weeks after hearing it for the first time. Anything I could ever want in a hip-hop project is on this record. It's such an impressively complete record. I'll start with pointing out the obvious. Like you said, this is a concept album. It details a dystopian future in the year 3030 where humanity and notably hip-hop are suppressed by the powers that be. Obviously the topic at hand is a little bit corny, a little bit nerdy, but I think it definitely uses that as a platform to, talk about some serious issues. There's lyrics on this thing about oppression and racism, but there's also lyrics about intergalactic rap battles. It definitely has a broad spectrum of just narratives and emotions portrayed. It's probably the most fun, the most just enjoyable throughout that a dystopian album has ever been. The concept of this record is all pretty tied together. I think I'm not sure actually if Del was the one who just came up with everything, if it was the whole group, but everything is tied together really well to the music. The skits fantastically flow with the album. The cover even is just so amazing. It definitely portrays the music perfectly. Concept albums tend to kind of live and die by their concept. If the concept isn't well put together, if it's all over the place, if it isn't enjoyable, then those albums do tend to suffer quite a bit. I think everything on here is just so enjoyable, so groundbreaking, so cutting edge, and just so unique in the world of hip hop that it definitely becomes a standout album just by that merit. But musically it's just fantastic as well. The production from Dan the Automator and Kid Koala's turntable work, it definitely helped create a very atmospheric yet bombastic soundtrack to the concept that is presented. In fact, the production is what sells a lot of the ideas, a lot of the motifs, a lot of the themes to the listeners so well. The sample work is breathtaking. The boom bap beats throughout never fail to keep the tracks exhilarating. And then there's Del the Funky Homo Sapien, who is just, to say he kills it on this project would be a massive understatement. He consistently delivers incredibly verbose, dense, cleverly assembled, and infectious verses, and his flow is just so smooth, so clean. It's impossible to not lose yourself in his charisma and his charm, and he just sends it home perfectly on this project. Everything here comes together perfectly. The concept, the production, the sampling, the turntable work, the lyrics, Del's flows, everything is just top tier. It's a masterpiece for sure.
Okay, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Deltron 3030 include 3030, Things You Can Do, The Keeps On Slippin', Turbulence Remix, Memory Loss, Virus, Mastermind, and Battle Song. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks are 3030, Things You Can Do, Positive Contact, Virus, Upgrade, Mastermind, Time Keeps on Slipping, Turbulence, and Memory Loss. My least favorite track is Battle Song.
All right.
On to the next one. The next album is The Cold Vein. Released in 2001, it is the debut studio album by Harlem hip-hop duo Cannibal Ox, consisting of MCs Vast Air and Vordul Mega. Production on this here project was actually handled by LP of now Run the Jewels fame, and it was released on his Definitive Jux label. Back then it was known as Def Jux, but due to legal issues the name had to be changed. It was the first ever project released on that label, and it's definitely a classic in the world of underground hip-hop. Mick, do you want to talk about it first, or do I talk about it first?
You talk about it first.
Alright, sounds good. This is another project that, just like Deltron 3030, I've been definitely meaning to get around to for a long-ass time. And, finally listening to it again, I'm in no way, shape, or form disappointed. If I could describe this project in one word, it would be quite easy. I'd have to look no further than the title. This album is cold. It's just production-wise very otherworldly. It's very harsh, mechanical, as I said, very cold. Some of the beats that LP crafts on this thing are just some of the most unique and intense I've ever heard in a hip-hop project. And, as a young producer, he definitely had something to prove on here, and he definitely does. He certainly does. Two MCs on here, Vordul Mega and Vastier, both deliver just equally intense and focused bars. Both of these rappers, showcase such talent and such a unique spin on the New York style that it's honestly surprising that neither of these rappers would go on to really release anything of note since. But for what it's worth, their performances on The Cold Vein are, so fantastic that they are by themselves career defining. Overall, I don't think it's a perfect album. I wouldn't rate it as highly as I would Deltron 3030, but it definitely holds a special place in the world of underground hip hop. And the reasons that this album went on to become a classic are just, there's many, and none of them fly over my head. It's definitely worthy of its praise, worthy of its influence, and its influence definitely not only in LP's further works, but also in just underground hip hop in general. You definitely see sounds on this project that would have translated into records down the line, to differing extents. But overall, it's a fantastic project, and it's definitely an influential one for sure, and a career defining moment for a very famous producer and rapper LP.
Yeah, The Cold Vein is pretty much a very important moment in underground and experimental hip-hop in general to me, because it was the first released under, at the time, the newly founded and important underground label Def Jux, which was co-founded by LP and Ameichi Uzagwi. I believe that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry if I butchered that. And, that label would give way to artists like Cannibal Ox in LP, obviously, as well as Aesop Rock, Murs, Del the Funky Homo Sapien, etc. The Cold Vein would also act as a pretty unique and forward-thinking album, as the sound and lyricism on this thing feels really unique for its time, and after this release, there would be more rappers that come out in this abstract hip-hop lane, over beats that go for a more unique and surreal vibe like this one. Rappers like Aesop Rock, Ka, the Armand Hammer Boys, and a few other come to mind in that respect. All of which have put their own unique spin on the things that was presented on The Cold Vein, but it all starts from here. It takes influence from this album. And even if we're taking its influence out of context, we're here with a unique yet quality hip-hop album. The rapping is the first thing I want to highlight on this album, as I've seen reviews and opinions on this album that completely overlook the lyricism because of LP's production, but I feel like it's important to highlight the lyricism because, quite frankly, it's fantastic throughout this album. Vast and Vordul are rappers that I haven't heard of before I got to check out this record, but they both left an incredibly strong impression on me with what they did on The Cold Vein, because they were consistently great and displayed some incredibly unique and interesting takes on hip-hop and lyricism. A lot of the lyricism on The Cold Vein heavily revolves around some typical themes that East Coast rappers from New York talked about, but with a more introspective approach and an emphasis on references and bars that are very sophisticated and even revolve around science at some points. Plus, they have the confidence and the bars to back it off, and they play off each other incredibly well on each verse. So to you, the listener, if you go into this album, please pay attention to the lyrics because they're important to this record, in my opinion. Now, of course, the main highlight and what people talk about the most when it comes to the Cold Vein, of course, is the production handled by El Producto himself. And of course, it's great. It's fucking LP we're talking about here. Guy's one of my favorite producers ever. The production throughout the Cold Vein is incredibly unique, especially for the time that came out in 2001, as I could barely think of anything that sounds like this. The beats on this album are very abstract, spacey, futuristic, and oftentimes ethereal. And it's very indicative of the title too, because it has this cold sound that works incredibly well with the lyrics, and they've just aged like fine wine. The soundscapes of the beats are fantastic. I love the drum samples that LP chose on here. They feel so punchy and so sharp, and the percussion is fantastic. Each has its own interesting nuances and dynamics. There isn't a single beat on this record that just sounds out of place or underwhelming to me, as this is some of the finest production that LP has ever done. It's abstract, it's unique, spacey, it complements what Vast and Vortal do. I suppose I don't really have much to complain about when it comes to the Cold Vein, really. It's a stellar hip-hop album from Cannibalox. It has some interesting and forward-thinking ideas that influence many others after this. The beats are fantastic, the rapping is stellar, and it's essential. And I suppose with that in mind, we'll move on to best of worst tracks. My favourite tracks on the Cold Vein are Stress Rap, Ridiculoid, Iron Galaxy, Ox Out the Cage, Raspberry Fields, The F Word, Battle for Asgard, Pigeon, and Scream Phoenix. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks are Iron Galaxy, Ox Out the Cage, A.B. Boys Alpha, Raspberry Fields, Straight Off the DIC, Vein, The F Word, Stress Rap, Pigeon, and my least favourite track is Painkillers.
Okay, and the next album we're going to talk about, we've already talked about LP already, but we're going to talk about him again, because the next album that we have here is 2002's Fantastic Damage. This is LP's debut album. He released 3 records in his solo ventures under LP, but of course, he was a huge part of Company Flow, and most notably Run the Jewels with Killer Mike. LP has been around since the late 90s and has made his artistic resume generally impressive, as he's been behind some very important stuff like the aforementioned Company Flow and Run the Jewels, as well as the Cold Vein, which we just covered there. Killer Mike's 2012 album Rap Music, and he also co-founded Def Jux, and of course he had his own solo music. The 3 albums he released are nothing short of impressive, but Fantastic Damage is the essential record here, so let's talk about it. Fantastic Damage is, I'd say, essential in my opinion because it builds upon the already unique, futuristic sound that LP presented on a lot of projects here before, production-wise, with a sound that leans heavily on a more raw, hardcore, eccentric, and somewhat industrial approach. I can't think of many records that sound like this in a hip-hop context, and it predates a lot of traditional industrial hip-hop that we know today. It may seem tame now, but imagine hearing this in 2002. Even with that in mind, LP also began to flesh himself out as a more unique MC with a lyrical approach and flow that feels much more personality-driven, referential, and dense. Fantastic Damage, more like Fantastic Album, because yeah, this thing is fucking fantastic. In my opinion, Fantastic Damage is one of LP's best produced projects. It may not be as refined as it would later become, but on an instrumental front, Fantastic Damage is impeccable and consistently amazing in my opinion. The drum samples on this thing are very punchy and sharp. The beats themselves are very raw, dense, distorted, and electronic. It sticks to the abstract futurism that we know LP for. The samples found in this record can range from industrial to funk. The production is so creative, versatile, entertaining, but we also get some great rapping to back it up. LP, can be a little hard to get into at first, especially with his flow, and there are instances where I can definitely see LP's flow rubbing some people the wrong way, especially since he jumbles his lines a lot, but when you get used to it and actually pay attention to what he's saying, then it'll be so rewarding, as his lyricism is incredibly dense, conscious, consistently entertaining throughout this album, and what he's saying gets emphasized further by his spoken word flow, which I find smooth, honestly. The subject matter on this album is often pretty bleak with what it explores. You can often come across fear, anger, paranoia, and confusion in the post 9/11 world of New York. It's apocalyptic, and it feels like a statement for the time, and a fine statement that it was. Even when it's 17 minutes at length, it never loses steam or loses momentum for me. It's incredibly consistent and manages to remain captivating, hard-hitting, gritty, and mind-bending for its entire duration. LP pulled out all the stops with this record, and while it certainly isn't the last amazing album that LP made, it's certainly one of his finest moments as an underground classic and an essential album in experimental hip-hop.
Yeah, definitely agree. From an album produced by LP to an album both produced and performed by LP. And if the Cold Vein saw LP really shine as a producer, Fantastic Damage really, really sees him shine as not only a producer but a rapper, front and foremost. The dude's pen game was just next level, even early on in his career. And, obviously if you're a fan of Run the Jewels, there's a lot, of material here that's definitely going to, satisfy those needs as well, because his pen game was just as good back then as it is now. Even with all the Run the Jewels records, my favorite part was always, as well as his and Mike's chemistry, was just the way that LP crafted lines and bars, the way that his flow was structured. It's so mesmerizing. He's such a talented and creative rapper, and as I said, even early on in his career, that's just as evident. His flows are just really tight and smooth, and he has an insanely confident presence on the mic, and LP really brings a lot to the table when it comes to his performances on here. It's definitely the standout feature of this project for me. But the production is also fantastic. It's not too dissimilar from the Cold Vein. Both albums definitely have LP's name written all over them. But the instrumental work here is definitely a little less subtle and a little more bombastic. It's just balls to the wall. It's chaotic, crazy. It's just intense at times. I think LP's energy overall definitely matches the production style perfectly. It's definitely I wouldn't say it's as good as some of his Run the Jewels work, but when it comes to his solo career, I can definitely see why this is considered to be the staple LP project. And Mick, you're right. Fantastic Damage, more like fantastic album.
Oh yes, my favorite tracks on Fantastic Damage are Deep Space 9mm, Tune Mass Damper, Dead Disney, Truancy, the Nang, the Front, the Bush, and the Shit, Accidents Don't Happen, Stepfather Factory, and Laserface's Warning. My least favorite track is Fantastic Damage.
My favorite tracks are Deep Space 9mm, Tuned Mass Damper, Dead Disney, DeLorean, Truancy, The Nang, The Front, The Bush, and The Shit, Stepfather Factory, TOJ, and Laserface's Warning. My least favorite track is Constellation Funk. Funk, sorry. Just taking a sip of water before we move on to not only the next one, but possibly, in my opinion, the big one. The next project is certainly one that needs no introduction. It's Mad Villainy by Mad Villain. Mad Villain was a hip-hop duo consisting of two absolute legends of the underground hip-hop scene, producer Madlib and the late MF Doom. Mad Villainy released in 2004, and it was the duo's first and only record, and has, in the decades since its release, has gone down to be not only that staple album in the world of abstract and experimental hip-hop, but just a staple in the world of hip-hop at large. The terms well-produced album and MF Doom, are so synonymous that it's hard to even talk about the production here without sounding like a broken record and saying things that a million other people have said about MF Doom projects. But the production here from Madlib is just another beast altogether. I'll talk about Doom's contributions in a second, but Madlib, holy shit, he created some of the most iconic, some of the most timeless, some of the most cutting edge, some of the most just creative instrumental work I've ever heard in the project here. The duo just work together so well. Their synergy together is just magnificent. It's probably in terms of production, it's probably my favorite record of all time in the hip hop sphere. Obviously, that's not to say that MF Doom doesn't really live up to the production with his verses, with his flows, because the style of production here just suits Doom's very villainous, mysterious persona perfectly. He brings forward a lot of his best, most infectious, and just most memorable bars throughout his entire career onto this project. He's so focused. He, delivers so many great one-liners. His flows are just on another level. His pen work is probably the best it was in his career at this point. Both of these artists would individually go on to and had already created just magnificent standout albums in the genre already. But Mad Villain was definitely where their two paths met for the greater good. This is just an incredible project. It's easy to see why this is such an iconic album, not only in the world of hip-hop, in the world of music at large. This is just one of those special albums that, I can't even imagine what it was like hearing this in 2004 when it came out. I probably would not have listened to any other music for like a month. I probably would have had this on repeat and been blown away. It's one of the best albums ever made, and by that standard, it's also one of the best experimental hip-hop albums ever made.
Yeah, what can I even say about Mad Villainy that thousands of others haven't said before? It's incredibly iconic, it's influential, it's boundary pushing, it's the definitive abstract hip-hop record, and it's a monumental moment where the rapper and the producer are a cohesive unit and a driving force behind the music, conceptually and sonic-wise. Like, do I really need to explain why this album is essential, honestly? Like, it's pretty much a fucking given if you're a fan of hip-hop, or even if you're getting into more abstract stuff. I'd recommend this, obviously, to start off with, out of anything we have on this list. And honestly, yeah, it's definitely one of the best on the list. Now, musically, this album is incredible, as the rapping and the production are simply stellar, and we see Madlib and Doom play off of each other's creativity and strengths in order to create a project that is incredibly unique and odd, yet personality driven, proficient, and executed incredibly well. It feels so far removed from much of anything that came out during its time aesthetically and instrumentally and lyrically. And it stands out to me on that merit. To start off, of course, MF Doom's rapping on this thing is incredible. His unique flows and his just dead specific way that he raps is impeccable. His lyricism here is conceptual and like a caricature of a villain, but he has the bars, he has the storytelling, he has the concepts, and he has the humor to back it up. Not to mention his rhyming, just so fucking incredible. It's so dense, and it's just consistently entertaining. Of course, Doom is only one piece of the puzzle here, as Madlib is another reason why this album is fantastic. His production is just fucking incredible on this album. He really just matches Doom's very cartoony and villainous aesthetic, and we see samples on this thing that have a lot of comic book aesthetics and sounds to them, most of which are, found on TV shows, movies, soul, and some jazz samples. There's some impressive samples on this thing that, there's some impressive samples on this thing, and even then, we see Madlib explore the abstract and push what can be done sonically on a hip-hop album, especially with a lot of the sonic detours that he takes on this album. Though the production is often disorienting and eclectic, the sampling on this thing is pretty experimental and odd, especially on moments like Accordion, Meat Grinder, Strange Ways, Sick Fit, Raid, and just so many other beats, and it acts as such an incredible way to back up a rapper like Doom. It was just a match made in heaven. It leaves such an incredible impact now, with how short the songs are, and even how little choruses are on this record. All that mattered was the beats and the rhymes, and both are spectacular on this album. MF Doom and Madlib are essentially figures in hip-hop anyway, so, check out Doom's work, like Food and Operation Doomsday. From Madlib, check out, Shades of Blue, Champion Sound, J-Lib, himself and Jay Dilla, both collabs with Freddie Gibbs, and, the first album under Quasimodo. But, make sure this is the first you hear, because, to put it fucking bluntly, this is incredible. This is one of the best hip-hop albums ever made, and yeah, it's just fucking essential. What more can I say there? And with that in mind, my favourite tracks on Mad Villainy are Fancy Clown, Accordion, Meat Grinder, Raid, Sick Fit, Curls, Operation Lifesaver, Figaro, Strange Ways, All Caps, and Rhinestone Cowboy. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favorite tracks are Accordion, Meat Grinder, Bistro, Raid, America's Most Blunted, Rainbows, Curls, Money Folder, Operation Lifesaver, Figaro, Strange Ways, Fancy Clown, all caps, Great Day, and Rhinestone Cowboy. My least favorite track is Hardcore Hustle. And here's a life hack: use commas when listing like 50 song titles.
Okay, so alright, moving on to the next album we have on our list, we have Absence by Dialect. This is I believe this is the third studio album from the New Jersey hip-hop group, which consisted of MC Dialect and a few other producers. I'm sorry, I don't have their names written down here, my bad. And Dialect is one of those acts in the underground hip-hop scene that were incredibly ahead of their time. They were on the industrial hip-hop thing long before a lot of the established acts, so they were incredibly ahead of their time on that merit, and they do have some essentials under their name, but we've got this album here, Absence, to go with. But you should definitely give the album from Filthy Tongues of Gods and Griots, which preceded Absence, and is the more famous album. Now, Absence is an essential album to me because it manages to blend together so many different sounds and influences into a sound that feels very specific to the fundamentals of East Coast hip-hop and boom bap. Throughout Absence, we see elements of industrial, noise, and dark ambient blend with the fundamentals, and as a result, we get a grimy, noisy, and sometimes terrifying sound. As an album, I really messed with it. I thought it was pretty damn fantastic and incredibly engaging throughout its runtime. It remains this dissonance and eeriness with walls of... It maintains this dissonance and eeriness with walls of noise that incorporates these beats that are just very progressive and layered. So much so that it feels beyond the limits of hip-hop, and this is what Dialect did. They pushed the limits of what you can hear in hip-hop, but it was just very quality. It was very mind-bending. While the production does feel way more atmospheric on Filthy Tongues and Gods of Griots, Absence still keeps it, but it's just noticeably layered with more noise. Either way, the production on Absence is just fucking incredible, but I will say, be prepared if you're not fully versed and ready to take on what you're about to hear. Now, I think the rapping is pretty solid on this album as well. MC Dialect, while not the most dynamic and standout MC, he's still a solid force behind the mic, and his lyricism is very much on point, in my opinion. A lot of the lyrics are very conscious, very political, so there's substance on that merit, and he sounds solid over these very noisy and industrial-sounding beats. It's such an esoteric listen on numerous fronts, and it has some of the most interesting sonic qualities that you could find in the 2000s underground hip-hop sphere. And I encourage you to give this album a listen if you are well versed in these sounds and styles, because it's essential.
Yeah. I saw a review of this project on Rate Your Music that compared it to the death consciousness of hip hop, which I think is also quite funny and a silly metaphor. But when listening to this project, there is a little bit of truth to that. It's easily the closest I've ever heard a rap album, ever come to the very noisy, shoegazy sound of, projects like Death Consciousness. The production on this project is just so atmospheric, so dense, so just powerful, so dark that, even if this was just an instrumental project, I still think it would have been fantastic. That being said, though, MC Dalek, really ties this shit together, man. His flows are just, just as dense as these instrumentals. The topics explored here are heavy, they're dark enough to be worthy of such a dark production style, and it helps that he just simply sounds at home among these instrumentals. It's one of the most unique projects on this list, in my opinion. It's definitely one that I've come back to probably more than any bar Deltron 3030 out of the ones that I haven't listened to previously. It's kind of a, I don't know what else to say other than it's definitely a one of a kind record in terms of hip hop. There's some influences here and there that I can definitely connect to different artists, different projects, different genres even. But as a whole, this project is just so unique and stand out. It's mind blowing.
All right. My favorite tracks from Absence are Asylum, Permanent Underclass, Culture for Dollars, Opiate the Masses, Distorted Prose, Absence, and Koner. Shouts to Koner 1. My least favorite track is Ever Somber.
My favorite tracks are Distorted Pose, Asylum, Culture for Dollars, A Beast Caged, In Midst of Struggle, Eyes to Form Shadows, Ever Somber and Opiate the Message. My least favorite track is Koner.
Oh, poor Koner won.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm trying to scroll down. Hold up. Oh, another big one. Another big one. Another one that needs no introduction. The next one is The Money Storm, the debut studio album from Sacramento.
Did you say The Money Storm?
The Money Store. I can barely talk. I'm having a heat stroke.
I'm actually the same, to be fair. Fuck me.
The Money Store. It's the debut studio album from Sacramento hip-hop group Death Grips, released in 2012, a year after the release of the band's debut mixtape, Ex-Military, which definitely attracted mass critical acclaim from music publications, from internet goers. And, you know, the album has gone down to be a defining moment again in the band's discography, but also one of the most iconic projects of the 2010s. Probably thanks in at least some part to Fantano giving it his first ever 10 out of 10 on his channel. The Money Store really puts experimental into experimental hip-hop. It really puts the hardcore into hardcore hip-hop, and it certainly puts the industrial into industrial hip-hop. It's just one of the most balls to the walls, insane hip-hop albums I've heard in the last decade. And in terms of, you know, experimental hip-hop, I think this album has already left a massive legacy on, you know, the genre. It's already proven to be insanely influential on, you know, music at large. And, you know, its iconic status is just growing exponentially since its release. For a lot of people our age, this project was almost a gateway into the experimental side of hip-hop. And, you know, for an average hip-hop head, you know, hearing this project for the first time without, you know, being aware of any kind of experimental aspects of music, this was definitely a challenging project for me when I first heard it. I mean, as I didn't really listen to much experimental at all. I listened to The Residents once when I was 12, and I was like, what the fuck is this? And I turned it off terrified. So yeah, this was definitely an important album for me. It definitely kind of ushered in a new era of just my life, where I kind of opened my eyes up to just a lot more bizarre stuff in music, a lot more unorthodox stuff in music. And, you know, it was definitely for me a gateway into the experimental side of not only hip-hop but music in general. The production here is just absolutely manic. It's noisy, it's industrial, it's just at times just almost too much, but in a good way, obviously. You know, it follows structures closer to glitch hop at times than in traditional hip-hop beats. And, you know, there's perhaps no MC who would, you know, even remotely attempt to rap over any, or rap is kind of, I'm using that term loosely, rap over any of these instrumentals other than MC Ride, the man himself. Ride's performances here are just equally as manic and insane. And as a performer, he's just absolutely unhinged, like as unhinged as this entire project is. And as the years have gone by, you know, I have grown more accustomed to not only Death Grips but experimental music in general, and the album doesn't really like shock me as it did back when I first heard it, but still every time I return to it, I appreciate it for a lot more than its you know intensity, and a lot more than its experimentation. I see this as an incredibly well produced, incredibly well structured, incredibly unique and cacophonous, gut punching project. And it's one of the most powerful, most intense experiences I've ever had listening to a hip hop project. You know, it's every single little sound, every single little instrumental, every single manic verse from MC Ride just add to, you know, this behemoth of a project. It's one of my favorite albums of the last decade, and I think its iconic status is very, very well deserved.
I mean, do I really need to explain why The Money Store is an essential experimental hip-hop album? It's the fucking Money Store. It's Death Grips. It kind of goes without saying, and you can't really go wrong with plenty of Death Grips projects like Ex-Military, Bottomless Pit, The Powers That Be, and of course what we're talking about here, 2012's The Money Store. Now, to me, The Money Store is an essential album in experimental hip-hop because I suppose it's one of the most forward-thinking and experimental releases from one of the most popular outfits in the experimental hip-hop field. It pretty much expands upon the hip-hop formula and does things that not many acts have ever done before on an album. It's the definitive Death Grips album, and it's a definitive album for the 2010s. Like, some artists would, get compared to Death Grips so much after the fact because Death Grips were fresh when they burst onto the scene. And while they didn't invent industrial hip-hop, they mastered it with a fresh take on the sound via the Money Store. In terms of the sound of this album, it's fucking nuts. It's a digital dystopia that features some incredibly distorted and chaotic beats that use very odd samples that sound so indistinguishable from what they originally came from. At the same time, a lot of the sounds and ideas on this album are just incredibly catchy and weirdly hypnotic. It's like sounds and ideas that are just so... It's like a fucking speed trip of an album, and it was just produced incredibly well by Zach Hill and Flatlander. And, nothing on this album sounds identical. Each track tries to go for its own thing while remaining consistent with its sound palette. Of course, I wouldn't be, talking about a Death Grips album without mentioning the one and only MC Ride, who, is at his most aggressive and is most consistent throughout this album, as he's just delivering on some incredibly insane and aggressive performances. The guy is practically screaming his fucking head off throughout this album, and he's saying some very abstract and weird shit while he's doing it. MC Ride adds a dynamic as a performer, but he matches incredibly aggressive and distorted digital beats very well. Like, who else would be on this production besides MC Ride? Like, it would be weird if it wasn't him, because, I don't know, it just feels so Death Grips. It feels like it belongs to MC Ride. Like, I don't know. I've said my piece. It's an incredible album. Every track on this thing is incredible. The production is insane. The performances are insane. In general, it's just such an insane album. Give it a listen. It's probably the first Death Grips albums you should hear. And, yeah, I think it's essential. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from the Money Store are Get Got, The Fever, Lost Boys, Hustle Bones, I've Seen Footage, Double Helix, The Cage, and Hacker. My least favourite track is Blackjack.
My favourite tracks... let me clear my throat. My favourite tracks are... There's a lot again. Get Got, Fever, Lost Boys, Hustle Bones, I've Seen Footage, Double Helix, The Cage, Punk Weight, Fuck That, Bitch Please, Hacker. And my least favourite track is Blackjack. That's a new world record. There you go.
World record speed run. Let's fucking go.
Money Store best tracks, any percent speed run.
Okay, we're moving on to the latter half of the list now, and we're probably starting here with the most famous album that we have on the list, and that is the 2013 album Yeezus by Kanye West. Yeezus is the sixth album from Kanye West, who at this stage doesn't need much of an introduction at all. I mean, it's Kanye fucking West, who for years has been pushing the envelope and popularizing certain sounds in rap for years, and Yeezus is for sure one of those records, and for sure it's an essential album for experimental hip-hop for me. I say that it's an essential record because, for one, Kanye West is a massive artist who, wasn't afraid to do whatever he did with his music. And Yeezus is one of those moments where Kanye felt like it was necessary to follow up one of his most critically acclaimed albums in My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy with a record that is as distorted, off-kilter, and as abrasive as Yeezus. Plus, it's a moment where experimental hip-hop was brought to the forefront of popularity by a huge mainstream artist, and having it turn out good was incredibly huge for industrial hip-hop. And while Kanye certainly didn't create it, he puts his own spin on it, and for what it's worth, it sounds pretty unique for the styles that he approaches. Plus, characteristically, it has everything that you would expect when it comes to, Kanye West in terms of themes, topics, but it's wrapped in an unexpectedly experimental and abrasive tone. I like Yeezus as an album a lot. The production is often the strongest aspect of Kanye's music, and that is a true testament to his talent as a producer, especially since he tries to bring in a new sound to each album consistently, and Yeezus is no exception. Yeezus' take on experimental hip-hop feels very inspired by electro-industrial and a lot of European electronic music, and that's the case given a lot of the production credits from the likes of Daft Punk, Rick Rubin, Mike Dean, Evian Christ, Travis Scott, Gesaffelstein, Arca, and many, many, many others. As a result, we get a hip-hop record that just feels so unlike anything that Kanye has ever done, and what many others have done. The sound of this album is consistently distorted, abrasive, cinematic, mind-bending at times, and it goes the fuck off on almost every track. And Kanye is just there saying and doing some of the wildest shit that he could. Like, some of the beats, bars on this thing are, easily some of his worst, but at the same time, they're just so goddamn funny because, who else would say that shit besides Kanye? Oh, not to mention, outside of the abrasive sonic approach of this album, there's just so many moments on the record that are just so euphoric and larger than life, and it sounds insane. And even 8 years after it's came out, it still sounds unique, and its influence can be felt. So yeah, Yeezus, all in all, essential.
I agree. Kanye is obviously an artist who's not afraid to push boundaries, and whether you love or hate this project, he certainly does the same on Yeezus. An album where Kanye is so manic, vulgar, and unapologetically just wild that moments on this album are a little indistinguishable between irony and Kanye actually just losing his mind. Honestly, there's a little truth to both, I think. It's definitely a bizarre project and a black sheep of sorts in Kanye's discography, which I wholeheartedly mean as a compliment. Again, I'll get more to that in a second. I just quickly want to cover the production first. The production here is just fantastic. I think Kanye finds a great balance between industrial noisiness and still retaining a style of production that, he can comfortably perform over. But as great as the production is, Kanye's performances are the standout feature here on this project. Kanye on Yeezus seems slightly unhinged in a good way. Some of the verses he spits and some of his one-liners here are so sorry, I'm after getting a Discord call. I don't know who. Some of the one-liners here is just so ridiculous that sometimes it honestly takes a bit to comprehend what you just heard. And while I think there's plenty, of sincerely emotional and real moments on this project, songwriting-wise, I think a lot of the more bizarre songwriting moments are very much self-aware. I think Kanye is trying to be entertaining, and I think the fact that Kanye isn't always serious definitely adds to the atmosphere of the album, and it kind of adds to the just craziness of it all. I can definitely see why people are torn on this project. And, if you already don't enjoy the material here, the ridiculousness of some of it can definitely make matters worse. But for me, this project, again, finds a great balance between, sincere frustration and some kind of comedic self-aware moments. I think the fact that this album is a lot more, had a lot more of a reach when it comes to, Kanye's audience size. He's definitely a mainstream artist. And the fact that some people who are just not really used to any experimental stuff may have heard this project as like their entryway into experimental stuff. I think that might add a little bit to some of the mixed reception, but I think generally I think most people I've talked to who are kind of familiar with more experimental types of music agree that this is a very good endeavor from Kanye, and it's personally one of my favorite Kanye West albums.
Alright, my favorite tracks from Yeezus are Blood on the Leaves, Bound 2, Hold My Liquor, Black Skinhead, I Am a God, and New Slaves. My least favorite track is Guilt Trip.
My favorite tracks are On Sight, Black Skinhead, I Am a God, New Slaves, Hold My Liquor, I'm In It, Blood on the Leaves, and Bound 2. My least favorite track is Guilt Trip. And
no Guilt Trip, love, of course.
The next project we're talking about is Danny Brown's Atrocity Exhibition. Atrocity Exhibition is the fourth studio album by American rapper Danny Brown, released in 2016 by Fool's Gold Records and Warped Records. It's easily Danny's most acclaimed and commercially successful record, and continues to be a staple in experimental hip hop in the 2010s, in the 2020s now. Where do I start? This project is a fucking masterpiece. It was my album of the year in 2016. And it hasn't grown off me one bit. With this album, Danny Brown did not only make a project that pushed boundaries, he just went out and created his own boundaries completely. On releases of his prior, Brown had already established quite a name for himself for his very chaotic and visceral style. But with Atrocity Exhibition, I think everything surrounding Danny, the instrumentals, the production, the nature of, Danny's performances, the atmosphere, just completely match this chaotic persona that he had already created over the years. And not only do they match it, it definitely allowed it to shine. And they definitely do. They shine in all their crazy glory. If you look at the vast majority of the instrumentals here, they do not really sound like rap instrumentals. They do not sound like it should even be possible to rap on them. They're so irregular, so psychedelic, just so wild. Sometimes there's like no established beat really. It's just kind of doing whatever it wants to. And Danny Brown just sounds at home. He sounds like he sounds like he doesn't need a beat. He doesn't need a hip hop instrumental. He'll rap over anything, and he definitely proves that here. It's just such an intense body like listening of experience that in his entire like catalog, his entire body of work, I think this is definitely the album where Danny Brown feels the most Danny Brown. I think other projects like Triple X and You Know What I'm Saying, I think both definitely do a good job of showcasing his talents as an MC, as a lyricist, as a performer for sure. But I think Atrocity Exhibition was an album that just plays to his personality, plays to his energy, plays to his talents so well that I think I'll forever connect Danny Brown with this project. This will definitely be the first one I always think of when I think of Danny Brown. It's just one of the most insane albums I've ever heard. It is definitely experimental hip hop. It's probably as experimental hip hop as it gets. It's an intense listening experience. It's so damn cohesive in its themes and its atmospheres, and Danny's just manic drug themed bars over instrumentals as visceral as these is just such a fantastic combination. It's one of the best albums of the last decade. It's one of my favorite hip hop albums of all time, and it's one of the best experimental rap albums of all time. There we go.
Hard fucking agree, my friend. Atrocity Exhibition, for lack of better words, is fucking insane. It's honestly one of the most insane and unique hip-hop records ever made, and Danny Brown is at the forefront of this album with such an off-the-wall and demented artistic vision. To me, it's essential for the simple fact that nothing even sounds like this fucking album. It's so demented, twisted, and surreal. There's a lot of albums that you could say, sound like you're on drugs or just on a horrible substance binge, but Atrocity Exhibition is one of those albums that you can definitely call a bad trip that's bringing you on a downward spiral to self-destruction, and that's literally what this album is from a sonic and lyrical standpoint. Plus, it's one of the best albums of the last decade, in my opinion, and should be considered an essential 2010s album in general, but for experimental hip-hop, it's a must-listen. It is experimental hip-hop. The production on this album is just so odd, abstract, and complicated. It's barely got much in the way of a sound that's conventional or easy to digest, except maybe the track Really Though, as, the samples that get utilized into the beats are just some of the most jagged, non-conventional, and just straight up fucking weird things I've ever heard on a hip-hop track ever. It's like, it's not even hip-hop, it's weird. I feel like the sound works well with the very self-destructive lyrics, and even when there's plenty of off-the-wall and non-conventional beats, there's some really solid catchiness to be found on some tracks, like the aforementioned Really Though, Pneumonia, and Dance in the Water. It's just so fucking wild from front to back. I can't imagine anyone else who matches these beats and is even capable of rapping over these beats other than Danny Brown. And this is easily the best that Danny has ever sounded, and this has some of his best lyricism. I don't know if I've ever actually talked about Danny Brown that much in the podcast before, but I absolutely love the guy's presence on a track. I love his wild and yelpy voice. On records like Triple X and You Know What I'm Saying, he can be so fucking funny with some of his bars, and lyrically the guy is capable of putting together something of substance and quality, which, is what he does on Atrocity Exhibition. Danny himself even says that, he was inspired by Joy Division and Ian Curtis, which you can definitely hear if you know anything about Joy Division and the life of Ian Curtis. Lyrically, it's demented and upfront about the indulgence and excess of the rockstar lifestyle, and it's a nasty reality that Danny is painting a picture of. It's depressive and dark, but it works well with what Danny is doing on these tracks, and the production matches. Since I've listened to it, it's slowly but surely become one of my favorite hip-hop albums ever, and Danny is one of my favorite rappers ever, so of course I have plenty of great things to say about him. But goddamn, this album is just so essential. It's fucking amazing. Listen to it if you haven't. It's incredible. And with that in mind, My favourite tracks from Atrocity Exhibition are The Downward Spiral, Tell Me What I Don't Know, Rolling Stone, Really Though, Ain't It Funny, Gold Dust, Pneumonia, Dance in the Water, When It Rain, Get High, and Hell for It. I have no least favourite tracks. I should have done that in a Danny Brown voice. Fuck it.
I'm not doing that. My favourite tracks are Downward Spiral, Tell Me What I Don't Know, Rolling Stone, Really Though, Lost, Ain't It Funny, Gold Dust, White Lines, Pneumonia, Dance in the Water, When It Rain, Today, and Get High. No least favourites.
Yes. Okay, alright, next album that we're going to be talking about. These next batch of albums are definitely the most recent ones on our list, and the first one to talk about here is Kid See Ghost's self-titled album, Kid Cudi, Kanye West, Kid See Ghosts. It came out in 2018. This is the big collaboration from Kanye and Kid Cudi, both of whom have worked with each other, before this project, and both of whom have been, those artists that have been open about their mental struggles. That's, basically the whole point of this album thematically, as, it's the result of two artists who have struggled and have found a way to, get through the darkness, explore their psyches, and essentially keep moving forward. On top of that, this is just a psychedelic odyssey with sounds that take influences from, I suppose, like 60s and 70s psych in some respects, and applies them to an atmospheric and dense hip-hop setting, and at times it is incredible and just wildly euphoric. I say it's essential because it feels like such a unique blend of hip-hop and psychedelia. Like I mentioned, it's a euphoric album with a dreamlike and often transcendental sound to back it up, and while it does this, it maintains its likable qualities about both Kanye and Cudi. In fact, Cudi sounds like he's at his absolute best on this project, and both artists have some of their best performances and lyrics on this project, some of their best to date. It's very short, but it leaves plenty of interesting and unique things to take away sonically and lyrically. The production of this album sounds very eclectic, very atmospheric, very well composed. The tracks in this record maintain this very psychedelic tone and sound, but convey different sounds and moods that are both exciting and meditative. I'd say for the exciting tracks like Feel the Love, Fourth Dimension, and Free, and the meditative tracks like Fire, Reborn, Kid See Ghost, and Cudi Montage. The sampling is very much the norm for Kanye, but I love some of the samples that he picks, and I really mess with every bit of the atmosphere and layers that the production has to offer. Of course, like I mentioned, lyrical sentiments are focused around Kanye and Cudi's mental struggles and how they overcome those struggles and, feel free. At the same time, they're both, at their most creative... Oh, for fuck's sake, why is he pulling in there? Never mind. They're at their most creative A-game with some incredible performances throughout, and they work well to each other's strengths and, create a dynamic album. It just feel especially... And that makes... what am I even saying here? I got distracted. They create a dynamic feel, especially with Kid Cudi's vocals and Kanye's rapping. Yeah, I just love this album. It's essential in my opinion.
I'm gonna kind of deviate from the norm here, because I'm not gonna be entirely positive about this project. I think Nick is already aware of the fact that I'm not incredibly obsessed with this album. Kid See Ghost, in my eyes, is a very good project, but it's also a very flawed project. I don't really doubt its place as a staple in experimental hip-hop in the last decade. I'm more than okay with it being here, even if it's not personally a project that I adore. But out of all the albums we've covered today and will continue to cover today, this is definitely my least favorite of the bunch. I can see why this project achieved critical acclaim. I just don't really see why this project achieved such high critical acclaim. It's very, very far from perfect in my opinion. And personally, there's times on this project where it all seems a little aimless. I'll start with the positives. Big positive for me is Kanye's and Cudi's chemistry and the vibrancy of their performances together. Tracks like Free and Reborn are just pretty much perfect in that aspect. I think the duo really, put the album on their back. Really, they showcase so much chemistry and so much synergy together. And the energy and emotion of the performances is just definitely spectacular. The biggest hit or miss for me personally is some of the production, some of the instrumentals. When it clicks, it very much clicks. For example, the fantastic Louis Prima samples on Fourth Dimension, or the serene but very lively instrumental to Reborn, a track that is easily the standout on this project for me. There's just moments where the instrumentals feel okay at best. Feel the Love, just for me, feels far too empty and scarce, and only really picks up pace at the end. And the juxtaposition between that and the very explosive vocals just makes the track feel very hollow to me. There's other moments like Cudi Montage where I don't dislike what I'm hearing. It just in no way does enough to stand out, either in a good or a bad way. It's definitely a good little album with some absolute standouts, but the brevity of it all and the inconsistency and quality in some moments make it feel like a little bit of an aimless affair. It's far from a masterpiece in my eyes, and I think there's times where it doesn't feel like it knows what it wants to be, and that's just my opinion.
Fucking boo, man. Alright, my favourite tracks from Kids See Ghosts are Feel the Love, Fourth Dimension, Free, Reborn, Kids See Ghosts, and Cudi Montage. My least favourite tracks are Fire.
My favourite track is Fire, Fourth Dimension, Free, Reborn, and Kids See Ghosts. My least favourite track is Feel the Love.
Bro. That stings. Fuck me, dude.
Moving on.
Moving on!
The next album is Earl Sweatshirt, Some Rap Songs. Some Rap Songs is the third studio album by Santa Monica rapper and former Odd Future member Earl Sweatshirt, and it was released in 2017 through Tankrasadia Records. 2018, that is correct. Wait.
You're welcome.
18. Okay, sorry, I thought it was 19 actually for a second. Man, time is weird. It was, with an album title as unassuming as Some Rap Songs, it's perfectly, wait, I'll rephrase that. An album title as unassuming as Some Rap Songs is just very perfectly tongue-in-cheek, and it's just such a perfect way to title an album that's so intensely portrays the deepest depths of Earl's psyche. It's definitely not Some Rap Songs. There's definitely so much more to it that the title doesn't immediately give away to the listener. And right off the bat, I think the title is one thing that ultimately doesn't matter when it comes to the music. But for me, I just wanted to give a moment to praise the album because I think it's fantastic. Just like Kids See Ghost, it's a rather brief project. It clocks in at 25 minutes, but in that 25-minute runtime, it explores and delivers some of the most intense, some of the most deep and in-depth, poignant, just portrayals of Earl's psyche that one could ever hope for. It delivers more in its 25 minutes than some rap albums manage in over an hour. Just like Kids See Ghost, it's wait, I'm reading the same bullet point again. I'm literally having a heat stroke. Send help.
Fuck.
Right, the instrumentals. I'll talk about the instrumentals now. They're very sample based, and I think the sample work here is used in a very subtle way. It's very dark. The samples almost sound like haunting and just otherworldly, and it definitely adds to a lot of the intensity when it comes to Earl's performances and just the dark nature of it all. It's speaking of Earl's performances, I think Earl's verses here are just intense. They're hidden under lo-fi production, and under all that production is some of his most cold, some of his most introspective, some of his most dark and intense verses of all time. It's definitely an essential when it comes to his career. I do think it's his best project, and it's also just an essential hip-hop album in the last decade. I think, especially given its length, I don't think it's an excuse for anyone to not have heard this project. It's just such a fantastic artistic statement from Earl, and it's such it's an important step in his career. And even since he was young with Odd Future, he's always had a knack for just being very mature and portraying very dark concepts and themes through his music. And as he's gotten older, that talent, that gift that he has for exploring his psyche in rap form has definitely just got better and better.
Yeah, some rap songs. Wait, what?
I'm overheating, dude. This is not real.
Oh no.
Might want to add that we're recording this in the middle of a heat wave, and I'm in a double insulated room with One window.
Yeah, at the end. We're both fucking dying right now, so
Yeah.
yeah. Some Rap Songs is a very abstract album, to say the least, but it's also a very potent and emotional statement from a young man who's just been through some traumatic things in his life, and it's a fine statement. To me, it's an essential album in experimental hip-hop, and especially abstract hip-hop, because the rapping style that Earl uses on this record, as well as some of the production techniques, feel definitive to Earl Sweatshirt as an artist, and no soon after, plenty of rappers such as Mavi and Mike would get labelled as Earl clones. And, while I certainly don't agree with that in a lot of cases, those comparisons are being made because of Some Rap Songs and how unique it is. The album certainly isn't for everybody, as the production on this is very jagged and rough around the edges with its sounds and samples, and I could definitely see people getting turned off by Earl's delivery and his rapping style, but for me, those two things coincide very well with each other, and the tracks stick because Earl's lyricism is very revealing, depressive, and personal. Lyrically, a lot of it revolves around his deeper plummet into depression over his father's death, and Earl doesn't hold back on what he's saying here and how he's feeling, and despite how short a lot of the tracks are, Earl is leaving a lot of impact on me, as his lyricism is just incredible, and what he's saying and is just fantastic, and I feel like the odd lo-fi production works well to his advantage. The rough production matches the tone of the lyrics, and the all-over-the-place sound might be a way to emphasize the darkness in songwriting, or reflect Earl's mental state, which, I could imagine was just pretty all over the place around the time that he made the album. I can hear comparisons to Mad Villainy in a sense, but to me, it's like a more fractured Mad Villainy, with a consistently sad tone. I do really enjoy the album as an artistic statement, and I think it's the best album that Earl has ever made, but it isn't without its criticisms, which, I have begun to notice over time, like, the beats, being a little too off-putting in some cases, but that's really it, because I think Earl made something pretty damn great with Some Rap Songs, and to me, it's essential for experimental and abstract hip-hop. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Some Rap Songs are The Mint, Azakor, Riot, Shattered Dreams, Nowhere to Go, December 24, On the Way, The Bends, Eclipse, and Playing Possum. My least favourite tracks are Red Water and Lucy.
My favourite tracks are Shattered Dreams, Cold Summers, Nowhere to Go, December 24th, On the Way, The Mint, Azukar, Eclipse, and Riot. My least favourite track is The Bends.
Okay, we're moving on to the last two albums here, and we have All My Heroes Are Cornballs by JPEG Mafia. And this came out in... This is JPEG Mafia's third studio album, and this came out in 2019. And JPEG Mafia has been around under so many different monikers and names, but obviously JPEG Mafia is one that people are more familiar with, and given the genre we're talking about here, we kind of have to mention him. Now, it was a tough choice between Cornballs and Veteran, but we both decided to go with Cornballs, which is my favourite of the two, and at this point, it was a perfect score for me. I mean, it isn't anymore, but either way, I still think it's incredible. The album is essential to me because it's one of those records that you have such a hard time trying to explain or pin down what it even is. So many sounds and styles and crossovers appear on this album, and given that so much is going on, it feels incredibly unique and unlike much of anything hip-hop has ever really seen. Plus, even if we're taking the production out of consideration, Peggy has so many great one-liners and bars throughout this thing that are, still kind of edgy and satirical. And I usually love Peggy's satire, so that's a given to my enjoyment of the album. All My Heroes Are Cornballs is definitely different for Peggy, but a lot of what we see on Veteran turns up here too, but I feel like a lot of the glitchy elements, as well as the industrial tinge and cloud rap inspired sounds, just feel more wrapped in a setting that's embracing a lot of pop inspired melodies and vaporwave textures. Peggy is even singing while slathered in autotune throughout this record. The production on this album is incredible to me. I love the layers and textures that Peggy has in the mix. A lot of the samples are very creative, and some of them are actually pretty funny additions if you know where they come from. Like, there's a fucking sample of Soulja Boy winning a game of Fortnite in here. How can this not be incredible? I love the mood of the cloudy atmospheres. There's genuinely some moments that are incredibly mind-melting, and whenever it doesn't have that ethereal vibe or goes for something more aggressive, it sounds pretty good. There's a track on here that I do think is pretty awful, but the rest is fantastic to me. JPEG Mafia's charisma is pretty damn great in this record. He's delivering some very entertaining bars throughout this thing. Jesus, there's so many great quotables throughout this record. It's insane, and for what it's worth, Peggy crafted something that feels truly distinct and fantastic. In short, I love this record. It's very unique, and yeah, it's essential.
Yeah, All My Heroes Are Cornballs is definitely hardcore hip hop for the internet age, and I mean that in just the best way possible. It's definitely a hard record to describe. Honestly, it's absurd. It's quite absurd, but it's absurdly confident as well. It's also confident in its absurdity. Peggy is just portraying just so many like weird emotions. The sample work is so tongue in cheek at times. Just so much craziness that's happening all over this project that it's really hard to pin down some of the stuff that you're actually hearing. Peggy is sometimes, because of this outlandish production and all of the craziness happening around him, it's kind of hard to notice the fact that Peggy is just such an incredible rapper and performer. Sometimes his performances aren't the main talking point when it comes to his projects. But for me, the standout moments on this project a lot of the time center around his just insanely exhilarating performances, his tight verses, his just overall addicting presence on the mic. I think Peggy really is a character, and the instrumental work on this project really does a good job to help that character shine. Instrumentals are just equal parts wacky, they're cutting edge, and whether or not I prefer Cornballs or his previous record Veteran is an internal debate that I have on a daily basis. I think for a video like this, Cornballs better portrays the experimental side of Peggy and experimental hip hop. I don't have much else to say. It's definitely one of those projects that are hard to describe, and you just kind of have to listen to. When you listen to it, if for some reason you haven't, you'll know what I mean.
Yeah, I agree. My favourite tracks from All My Heroes Are Cornballs are Jesus Forgive Me, I Am a Thought, Keenan vs. Kel, Beta Male Strategies, Grimy Waifu, PTSD, All My Heroes Are Cornballs, Prone, Thought Tactics, Free the Frail, Post-Verified Lifestyle, Dots Freestyle Remix, and Pappy I Missed You. My least favourite track is Life's Hard, Here's a Song About Sorrel. That track is awful. I hate it.
My favourite tracks are Jesus Forgive Me, I Am a Thought, Beta Male Strategies, Grimy Waifu, Rap Grow Old and Die, No Child Left Behind, Prone, Thought Tactics, Free the Frail, and Post-Verified Lifestyle. My least favourite tracks is Buttermilk Jesus Type Beat.
I fucking love that title so much. Fuck.
Yeah. On that note, we're on to the last album that we're going to cover today. We're going all the way to the year 2020, and it's Clipping, Visions of Bodies Being Burned.
It's Clipping, bitch.
Yeah. Visions of Bodies Being Burned is the fourth studio album from LA experimental hip-hop / industrial hip-hop / noise collective Clipping, released in 2020 through Sub Pop. And it's a direct sequel to the group's 2019 album, There Existed an Addiction of Blood. Both records saw them, venture in a direction very reminiscent of horrorcore and influenced by a lot of slasher films and horror films in general. This album is a special one for sure. An album is different when it can make you feel anxious, it can make you feel scared, it can make you feel uncomfortable, but also excited all at once. Visions of Bodies Being Burned definitely does all of those things and more effortlessly from start to finish. The project really just feels to me like the ultimate Clipping album. It's a showcasing of a lot of the stuff that Clipping have already showcased throughout their career. A lot of the talent, a lot of the instrumentals that they've worked hard to create throughout the years. I think everything kind of comes together on this project better than it ever has, and possibly better than it ever will. I had pretty high expectations, coming into this album when it was released last year. And even then, I just was not ready for what I heard when I first heard this album. It is, my first experience listening to this project was just a sensory overload in the best way possible. The production on this project is just out of this world. Sure, it's reminiscent to some of their previous work, especially obviously their previous album, which is a direct prequel to this project. But I don't think anything in their catalog holds a candle to just the level of calculated madness and the unsettling soundscapes that they create throughout this project. And as always, David doesn't just sound comfortable rapping over these instrumentals, he sounds like he was made for them. His highly technical and erratic rapping just adds to the intensity of the music even more. The fact that this was influenced by slasher films is quite apparent from the themes and when listening to this project, and even just from the sounds and atmosphere of this project. But I really do think that this is the closest I've ever heard an album come to actually, feeling like watching a slasher film or a horror film. The attention to detail here, the execution, everything is just fantastic. And it's my favorite Clipping album for sure, and it's a good way to end off this list. What do you think of this album, Mick?
Very good. Me likey some Clipping, me likey some Visions of Bodies Being Burned. And Visions of Bodies Being Burned is really something else. And if you've been keeping up with our podcast episodes, then you know that we like ourselves a little bit of Clipping. And this album in particular is the one that we mess with the most when it comes to the group. As, of course, this is why this album is here. You can't really go wrong with any Clipping, really, including their self-titled and the sister album to Visions of Bodies Being Burned, There Existed an Addiction to Blood. But of course, Visions is the main focus of discussion today. And yeah, it's an incredible album. In terms of why I think it's essential, I think that Visions of Bodies Being Burned is Clipping's best album. It feels like the album that truly defines them as a unique act in experimental hip-hop. It's filled to the brim with nothing but incredible sounding yet unnerving material that I just can't help but feel sucked into, and it tries to push the boundaries of what experimental hip-hop can do sonically while also staying true and blue to the experimental and horrorcore edge of There Existed an Addiction to Blood. The album itself is incredibly intense. It's unnerving. The sound design that gets implemented here is often very cinematic and atmospheric. The combinations of noise, industrial hip-hop, dark ambient, and horrorcore go over extremely well. It has fusions and moments on it that feel very unique and are still mind-blowing to me even nearly a year after it came out. And it remains very consistent with the tones that it sets. David sounds incredible over this production. He always had a knack for standing out to me as a voice in hip-hop, but the man just never fails to be fazed by these instrumentals. He works so well over them with his hectic flows and horrifying lyrics that remain true and blue to the horrorcore aesthetics and feel inspired, by tropes and narratives of different kinds of horror movies. He's the perfect narrator to these cutthroat beats, and he does a damn fine job of doing that throughout this album's duration. I can't imagine anyone else rapping over these beats except for David Diggs. The guy's incredible. And like you said, it's just, it literally just feels like you're watching a slasher movie. It's basically a slasher movie in horror, in audio format, and I love it. The album just blows my mind still, and, I of course highly recommend it. My favourite tracks from Visions of Bodies Being Burned are Intro, Say the Name, 96 Neve Campbell, Something Underneath, Make Them Dead, Pain Every Day, Check the Lock, Looking Like Meat, Body for the Pile, and Enlacing. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks are Say the Name, 96 Neve Campbell, Something Underneath, Pain Every Day, Check the Lock, Body for the Pile, and Enlacing. My least favourite track is Eaten Alive.
And we did it! We talked about all the albums that we wanted to. That was fun. I really enjoyed that. And yeah, I suppose we'll end it off here. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Genre Essentials. We would really love to hear some feedback if you have any for us. We'd really appreciate that just to improve this series. From a first glance though, I really like doing this and I can't wait to do more of them. And what are some of your favourite albums that we covered in this list? Are there some albums that you think we should have covered? Please let us know. Be sure to check out our necessary links in the description below to our own YouTube channels and our Rate Your Music and Album of the Year, of course. Be sure to check out some previous podcast episodes. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
See you!
Bye.